Okay, so we are going to talk about acid-base balance, and our bodies require homeostasis, and in order for our cells to function properly, we have to have this balance between our acid and our bases. And this is going to be found in each of the fluid compartments and has to maintain an equilibrium to function properly. So let's take a look at some of the ways that our body is actually going to handle these imbalances and things that might actually occur when there is an imbalance. And one thing we need to understand is that the imbalance is not the disease itself. It is actually a symptom or because of another problem, because the things that are going to control our acid base, like our buffering system, our lungs, and our kidneys, are going to actually be what has been altered in order for there to be an imbalance within our body. So these are the three systems, and we're going to go over them here shortly, that are actually going to help maintain that homeostasis. So when there is an imbalance, there's usually a problem within one of these systems. So some diseases that can go along with these imbalances are going to be diabetes, maybe even that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, because that has to do with the lungs. And then any kind of kidney disease or kidney damage can actually cause some acid-base imbalances as well. So the pH is measured by the hydrogen ion concentration within the body's fluids. So this is the first part of this acid-base balance. And the pH is going to tell us whether or not we are acidic or whether or not we are alkalytic. And the pH, it has a very narrow range that's going to require all of those different body systems I was just mentioning to regulate it, and to regulate it over specific amounts of time. So basically, here's what happens. A hydrogen ion is going to determine the pH based on whether or not it releases, or whether or not it is accepted to a molecule when that hydrogen ion enters a solution. So an example, an acid is going to be formed by the release of a hydrogen ion when it is put in a solution. And a base is going to be formed when the hydrogen ion is attached, or it's accepted to a molecule when it is placed in a solution. So there's very much an inverse relationship between the concentration of a hydrogen ion in a solution and the pH of that solution. So like we just said, when a hydrogen ion is either accepted or released, this is going to determine whether or not the pH is going to be considered acidotic or alkalotic. So, and there's an inverse relationship. So what I mean is the more hydrogen ions that are released, or that are just free roaming in whatever the solution is, the pH will correspond by decreasing, which is going to indicate that it has more acidity, or it is acidotic. The less hydrogen that is just free and floating around, but is actually attached to other molecules, creating a base or an alkalotic state, the higher the pH is going to be. So that higher pH is going to indicate alkalosis. So the range that we're going to be talking about that's going to be normal for a human body is going to be between 7.35 to 7.45. So like I just said, if it's less than, so if the pH number is less than, it's going to be acidic, because all those hydrogen ions are going to be floating around, and hydrogen ions are considered an acid. If it is greater than 7.5, that means those hydrogen ions have attached to something else, losing their acidity, and so they become alkalotic, or a base. So if we look at this figure, You can find it in your textbook. You can see that that normal range for the pH, again, is that 7.35 to 7.45. And it's going to be maintained by a ratio of 1 part carbonic acid to 20 parts bicarbonate, which is our base. And as it's represented in the picture, you can see that naturally the human body has more base than acid, and so it's a very narrow range between that 7.35 and 7.45. Now, something you need to understand about the carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is produced in the body and is what can be broken down into carbon dioxide and water. And so this is one of the ways that the body can actually expel an acid through the lungs or through the respiratory system, because it breaks it down into that carbon dioxide, which when we exhale, we are actually pushing out carbon dioxide in our body. So as the body will metabolize other acids, it can actually expel them through fluid excretions or through our urine. So these are the ways that these kind of break down, and we're going to go over that here in just a minute. So most acids are considered weak, and they really don't release or accept very many hydrogen ions, but we still have to have some systems in place in our body so that when we have more acid or if we have more base, we can get back between that narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the buffer system. And this just basically, it's going to prevent major changes in the pH by removing or releasing hydrogen ions. So an example is when acids increase in the body, a buffer is going to bind to the hydrogen ion basically to kind of neutralize it so that there's minimal change in the body's pH. Alternatively, if the base in the body increases, then the buffer will release the hydrogen ion, and this is going to release into the fluid, and it's going to help bring that pH back to within that normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. And this system basically works in fractions of a second, but it is also limited in the amount that it can actually attach or release. So at one time, it cannot be the only thing that is maintaining this acid-base balance, but it is the quickest, it's the fastest system that works to try to maintain our acid-base balance. The next one is going to be the respiratory system, and it controls the carbon dioxide that is retained or eliminated from the body. So remember, I just talked about that carbonic acid, and basically that is made up of carbon dioxide and water. So when that carbon dioxide and water are combined, we have carbonic acid. Now, how the respiratory system works is it's actually going to send a signal to the cerebral respiratory center in our brain, and it's going to respond to changes in that acid base, whether it is going to hold on to the carbon dioxide, which means that our respirations might slow down or become very shallow, or we may try to get rid of the carbon dioxide and split the water and split the carbonic acid into the carbon dioxide and water and try to expel more of that carbon dioxide. Think about when a patient is hyperventilating, so they're breathing way too rapidly and they're pushing off too much of that carbon dioxide. So our respiratory system kind of regulates that, and our breathing will change based on the trigger of the acid-base balance within our body, and it will send that signal to the cerebrorespiratory center. So this is going to take more of minutes to hours to really change and actually regulate the acid-base balance. So it's still faster than the renal system, but it's a little slower than that buffer system. So it's kind of our middle ground. The renal system is going to be responsible for excreting any kind of excess acids, but it's also going to help assist by retaining bicarbonate within the renal tubules. So anytime our body has a shift in our acid-base balance, the kidneys are going to function. If we're more acidic, our kidneys are going to try to get some of that excess acid out. And it's also going to try to hold on to that bicarbonate, basically shifting that balance back into that 7.35 to 7.45 range. So because we know that excretion actually is a longer process, our kidneys have to filter everything and all of that. This process is actually going to take anywhere from hours to even days to actually achieve a buffer. So we may not see those changes in our patients as quickly when it is a renal issue, and especially if you've got any damage to your kidneys, that's going to slow that process down even more. So we have the buffer system, which works really quickly. It either holds on to a hydrogen ion or it pushes one out or releases one. Then you've got the respiratory system that is either holding on to that carbon dioxide and combining it with water to make the carbonic acid, or it's releasing the carbon dioxide so that we are releasing the acid, whichever one is needed. And then you've got your renal system, which is excreting the extra acid and holding on to that base in order to help our bodies reach that homeostatic status. Let's talk about how the buffering system actually works in the body, because it is our primary way of regulating the acid-base balance, especially if we have proper functioning respiratory and renal systems. So if those two systems are working correctly, then this buffer system is what's going to actually work most of the time in our bodies, and it acts on the chemical level, and it's going to change a strong acid into a weak acid or neutralize the acid, and then either the renal or respiratory system can release those acids if it needs to. So this is why those systems have to be working correctly. So let's take a look at how I have it written out here. It's a formula. So one way that it's going to actually work is it's going to exchange that hydrogen. So if you look at the first part of this formula, we have hydrochloric acid. That's that HCl. And then what it's going to do is it's going to exchange that hydrogen, and it's going to actually attach it to this sodium bicarbonate. So we have hydrochloric acid and sodium bicarbonate, which are both strong bases, or one's a strong acid, one's a strong base. What it's going to do is it's going to move the sodium over to the chloride, and the chloride is going to give up that hydrogen and attach itself to where the sodium was, and what that forms is actually that carbonic acid. So now we have salt and carbonic acid, which is going to be a much weaker acid because it can easily be broken apart into water and carbon dioxide. So the reason it's weaker is because it's broken apart a lot easier. But when it was over here in this form of sodium bicarbonate, it wasn't as easily broken down, and it actually wasn't broken down into an acid. So couple things that we need to understand is this hydrochloric acid, it's going to be found in our GI tract, and the reason it's such a strong acid and we want that strong acid in our GI tract is because it's going to help break down our food. So when you think about it, we need that in our body. But we also need a way to neutralize that just in case we get too much of it, or say we're eating something that has a lot of acid as well. We don't want that hydrochloric acid just to keep increasing. So our body also produces this sodium bicarbonate, and it's going to be produced in the pancreas and in the stomach, and that's going to actually help neutralize that hydrochloric acid when it swaps the hydrogen ions. So then we have that salt and that carbonic acid. And so like I said, that's much weaker. And this allows the body then to, again, either expel the carbon dioxide so that it can make that pH within balance, or If our body is more alkalotic at the time, it's going to hold on to that carbon dioxide, just depending on what is going on within our body systems. So, some other ways that our body is actually going to utilize and help this chemical buffering system is going to be through the use of phosphate. And phosphate is one of the major buffering systems that's actually going to be located inside the cell. And if you remember, in fluid and electrolytes, we've talked about how phosphate was found intracellularly. So it's one of the major anions inside the cells. So it's going to be the major buffering system inside the cell. Now, it can also be found in the extracellular fluid, so you will see small amounts that are going to be buffering in that extracellular fluid, but what it's going to do is the phosphate is going to combine with sodium so that it can help neutralize a strong acid into a weak acid and a salt, just like we saw with our hydrochloric acid and our sodium bicarbonate. So it just forms sodium biphosphate. Sorry, had to think of how to say that after I said the sodium bicarbonate. So basically this phosphate and sodium are going to combine and they're going to make up sodium phosphate. And when they are, the way that they work to neutralize a strong acid is, again, your sodium is going to attach to, say it's that hydrochloric acid, it's going to attach to that chloride, and the hydrogen is going to be given up to the phosphate, and then you would form sodium biphosphate. So you would have the salt, and then you would have the biphosphate. And it can also take a strong base and neutralize it into a weaker base plus water. So it can work both ways on that one. Now, the next system is going to be with proteins, and proteins can be broken down into amino acids, and amino acids are what actually are going to attach or release the hydrogen ions to help maintain that equilibrium. Then we have our hemoglobin, or the red blood cells in our vessels and in our vascular system, and they're going to be one of the major components within that vascular system, because if you think about, our red blood cells are going to be accepting and releasing hydrogen ions, because that's how our body gets its oxygen in, and then how it also excretes some of that carbon dioxide. So the way that when our red blood cells have the oxygen in them, the red blood cells are pretty much saturated, so they're not going to be accepting a lot of those hydrogens. But as soon as that oxygen is given to the body and to the tissues, now that red blood cell is readily available to accept some of the hydrogen ions, and it can actually form that carbonic acid, and then it can excrete it through the lungs if it needs to break it down into the carbon dioxide and water, or however it needs to take care of that acid-base balance. So that's how our hemoglobin can actually help in this buffering system. Now, the last one is going to be on the cellular level, and the cell itself can actually help to buffer both the extracellular and the intracellular, and it does this by exchanging a hydrogen ion for a potassium. So if you've got more hydrogen ions on the extracellular fluid, what's going to happen is that the hydrogen ion will move into the cell, but once it gets into the cell, it's going to force potassium out of the cell. And what can result is that then in your blood you've got hyperkalemia, or high potassium. So the hydrogen moves into the cell, the potassium has to get out. And when the potassium is in the blood, we have a hyperkalemic state. Now the opposite is also true. So when a hydrogen is going to be forced out of the cell or drawn to the extracellular fluid, the potassium is going to move into the cell. And when this happens, we also can end up in a hypokalemic state because our potassium has now moved into the cell. So if the hydrogen moves out of the cell into the extracellular fluid, the potassium is going to move into the cell, and this could form a hypokalemic state. Now, one thing I want you to remember with all of this that we've just discussed with the buffering system, the things that have to be working properly in order for this system, the buffering system that works the majority of the time, to work properly, we have to have a functioning respiratory system and a functioning renal system, and they have to be working properly. Now let's look at the respiratory system and how it helps regulate our acid-base balance. So first off, we've got carbon dioxide and water. And like we've already talked about, when we have that carbon dioxide and water and we add them together, they make that carbonic acid. And carbonic acid can also be broken down into that bicarbonate and a free hydrogen. And remember, we just talked about that buffering system, that hemoglobin is going to attach itself to those free hydrogen, and it's going to act like that buffering system within the blood. So remember, the respiratory is going to also act with the blood because our blood goes to the lungs. So this is where that is kind of a key component. And as we know, we've already talked about how our brain is going to signal our respiratory center, which is in the medulla, anytime there is a change in our pH. And so what it will do is it will increase the amount of respirations as well as the depth that a person is breathing if we have too much of an acid. And so what that does is it releases that carbon dioxide in our lungs. And remember, because that carbon dioxide, when it was dissolved into the water, was the carbonic acid, the increase in the expiration of CO2 is going to decrease the amount of carbonic acid that is in the body. So I want you to stop. I want you to think about, how is this going to affect or change the pH? So if we are blowing off CO2, which creates an acid, what's that going to do to the pH? So if the acid decreases, the pH goes up. So remember, when we have that 7.35 to 7.45, that's that normal range. So that's what our respirations are trying to stay within, that normal range. But if we're decreasing the amount of acid that's available, we're going to get closer to that 7.45, or potentially even go above it and create an alkalotic state. So remember, if we are breathing off a lot of CO2, our patients could wind up being alkalotic. Now, normally what's going to happen if our brain is functioning correctly, as soon as we hit that alkalotic state, our brain is going to trigger our respirations to decrease. So in alkalosis, or if your patient has alkalosis, then the respiratory system is going to tell the lungs to stop excreting the CO2. We want to decrease these respirations so that our body will hold on to the CO2 and increase the amount of carbonic acid that's in the body. Because like we just said, that CO2 is going to attach with the water to form that carbonic acid. And so when the acid increases, our pH is going to drop. And so it'll bring us back down below the 7.45 and could lead us to that 7.35 or lower. And depending on how much is decreased, we could end up in an acidotic state. So if your patient is not breathing or has decreased respirations for any reason, this is because the body is trying to hold on to that CO2. And when it holds on to the CO2, it is trying to increase the acid in the body. So, a couple things that you can think about when you think about this. If your patient is breathing very rapidly, very heavily, they are probably headed toward alkalosis, or they are trying to correct acidosis. They're trying to blow off the acid. So if they start out as alkalotic, their body's going to increase their respiration so that we can move them toward alkalosis. If our patient or the body is in alkalosis, we're going to see a decrease in the amount of respirations because we are trying to hold on to that CO2. The body is trying to correct the alkalotic state by holding on to the CO2, which will increase our acid. So the renal system is going to be the third system that we're going to talk about that is going to help regulate our acid-base balance. And if you remember, the renal system is that long-term regulator. It takes the longest to respond to pH changes, but it also can have some lasting effect because when the renal system is functioning normally, it can excrete hydrogen ions after cell metabolism, as well as it can hold on to that bicarbonate that's in the extracellular fluid. So urine is normally going to be very acidotic because this is how the body can excrete large amounts of acid, and it simply does this just by eliminating the excess free hydrogen ions, as well as excreting ammonium, which is just simply that ammonia that attaches to a free hydrogen ion, or by excreting or expelling those very weak acids through elimination. So we've gone over 3 different types of systems that help us understand how our body is going to regulate our acid-base balance. So remember, our body wants to be within that normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. It has to maintain this balance of 20 to 1, the bicarbonate being 20 and the carbonic acid being 1. It has to have this ratio to be within that normal balance, to keep it between that 7.35 and 7.45. When this ratio is disturbed, this is what results in an imbalance, and we can measure this with our arterial blood gases, or our ABGs. And the arterial blood gas can show us a better look at how the lungs are functioning, how the renal system is functioning, and the arterial blood does a better job than the venous blood because the arterial kind of gives us that whole body picture, and it can also tell us how well the lungs are actually oxygenating the blood and how much oxygen is available for tissue use. So when there's a disturbance in any one of these systems, we can see it by looking at our ABG levels. So it's important that we start to really understand what these ABGs represent and what systems are going to be affected by the different values when we look at our ABGs. So, because this can help us understand what an underlying cause may be. Because remember, when we started this whole lecture, we stated that imbalances are not the problem. They're just simply a symptom of an actual problem within some other system. So, learning to interpret these is going to help you determine an actual problem within a renal system or within a respiratory system that's going on with your patient. So, like we've already said, we're going to classify these as either a respiratory imbalance or a metabolic imbalance if it's going to be on the renal or molecular side that has an issue. If the change in the pH is below the 7.35, we're going to classify that as acidotic or acidosis because there is more acid in that acid-base ratio. And if the pH is going to be greater than 7.45, this is going to be classified as alkalotic because the base is greater in that acid-base ratio. We also can determine whether or not our imbalances are going to be acute, which just means that there's some type of short-term injury, or if it's a chronic problem, which is from a long-term disease process. And if that's the case, our other regulating or buffering systems are going to try to compensate. So think about in the diagnosis of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We're going to see that our pH might be within normal range, but it's not because our lungs are working correctly, because we know we have this pulmonary disease that's causing our lungs not to work correctly. So our kidneys have kicked in. And remember, our kidneys were those long-term regulators. So our kidneys have kicked in to compensate that pH. So they're holding on to their, well, in COPD, you actually are not blowing off enough CO2, so your acid is going to be higher, so your kidneys are going to hold on to any of those bases or bicarbonate, so you're going to see an increase in that in order to try to regulate that pH. So that's how we can kind of tell whether or not something chronic is going on or whether or not it is an acute issue. And we'll get into all of those levels here in just a second. So the first thing I want you to kind of look at is this chart. You can find it in your book if you want to follow along with this. The top portion is going to be looking at our respiratory imbalances like we were just talking about. So it's going to represent what happens when there's a respiratory issue that's causing the imbalance. So when we're holding on to too much CO2, then the carbonic acid is going to increase. And this is going to result in an acidosis because we're going to have more of this carbonic acid than we normally do, but our base has not changed. Our base did not increase. So it's a respiratory acidosis because our carbonic acid is in excess, but our base is still in that 20. So we're looking at that. Remember that 20-to-1 ratio is what gave us the normal. So if our acid is higher, but our base did not change, then we are acidotic. When our body is trying to blow off too much CO2, we become alkalotic, or we go into respiratory alkalosis. And this is because we don't have enough carbonic acid. We don't have that 1 in proportion to the 20 that we have of our bicarbonate. So the bicarbonate is still within that normal range of 20, but our carbonic acid is what has been depleted. So our body has blown off too much of that CO2, and the result is going to be a respiratory alkalosis. Now, the lower portion, or the lower part of this chart, we're going to see what happens with the metabolic changes. So if you notice, the carbonic acid stays at 1. It's not changing. What is changing is the bicarbonate. So it is a metabolic change. It is whether or not our kidneys are getting rid of too much bicarbonate. They're allowing too much to leave the body, or it doesn't have enough, which is going to result with acidosis because that 20-to-1 ratio is off. It doesn't have the 20 of the base. That's what makes it acidotic. But if our body or our renal system is holding on to that bicarbonate or making too much bicarbonate, so now we have too much, we're in excess, you can see that our 20-to-1 ratio is actually higher in base, so we have metabolic alkalosis. So we can see the difference between respiratory and metabolic on this chart. Now, these numbers do not actually represent the ranges that we're going to talk about in just a second. This is just simply a ratio to help you understand. We have 1 acid to 20 base within that normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. And when that ratio of 1 to 20 is off, we can wind up with that acidosis or alkalosis. So when we look at our ABGs and we go to interpret what the values are telling us, we can kind of understand what caused the imbalance. We can assess the severity of the imbalance, as well as whether the body is trying to actually compensate for the imbalance with the other buffering systems. It also looks at the amount of oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma, the PaOT is actually going to look at the pressure that's exerted by the oxygen in the plasma. And so whatever is dissolved in the plasma is what is available for our bodies and our tissues to use. And so this is what actually is going to help us look at the patient's overall oxygen status. Now, the normal pH levels that we're going to be looking at, and remember the pH is just simply a representation of that ratio of acid to base that's available in the blood, and we've got to remember that that normal ratio is going to be 1 acid to 20 base. Now, that's not represented in these numbers. We just kind of need to know that in our heads. So, the pH is going to be 7.35 to 7.45. Then we're going to get down to the PCO2, and the PCO2 represents the respiratory function and the amount of CO2 that the body is going to hold on to or that the body is blowing off. And that range is going to be between 35 to 45 millimeters per hemoglobin. Then we have the PaO2, and this is the amount of oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma and it's ready for tissue use. And then we have the bicarbonate, or HCO3, which represents the renal regulation of bicarbonate. And this level is going to be 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. So that means that's how much is actually dissolved in a liter. So if you look at this, this is why our numbers are not going to be that 20 to 1, because 1 is measuring the pressure that the carbon dioxide is placing on the hemoglobin when we measure the blood. The other one is a measurement of how much bicarbonate is dissolved in a liter of blood. So this is why these numbers look different from what that 20 to 1 ratio we were talking about. So I need you to memorize these numbers right here. Then the SaO2 is going to be the oxygen saturation that's on your hemoglobin. And then the base excess, this is going to measure the molecules that are going to be available in the blood to be used by that buffering system that we talked at the very beginning of this lecture. And that's that system that either accepts the hydrogen ion or releases the hydrogen ion on that quick, fast buffering system. So it's the capacity at which the body can utilize that buffering system that we were talking about. Okay, so we're going to use the Rome method as we interpret our ABGs, and this is going to be a method that's going to kind of follow you through nursing school at SEC. So if you haven't learned the Rome method, you may want to go ahead and try to get an understanding of it, because it's going to kind of go from semester to semester. But anytime we're looking to interpret ABGs, we need to follow a systematic approach when you start. So always start at the top of the ABGs and start with your pH. Determine if that pH is normal. Remember, normal is going to be between 7.35 and 7.45. If it is less than 7.35, then you are going to be acidotic. If it is greater than 7.45, then it's going to be alkalotic. So that pH is what determines if it's acidotic or alkalotic. The next number that you're going to look at is going to be the PCO2. And the PCO2 is going to be between 35 and 45. And if it is less than 35, then that means the carbon dioxide is being blown off. So less than 35, your patient is probably going to have a pH that's going to be above 7.45 because they're going to be alkalotic. Remember that that carbon dioxide mixes with water and becomes carbonic acid. So if we don't have that carbon dioxide in our body, then we're probably going to be alkalotic. If our patient pH is going to be greater than 45, that means that the body is holding on to that carbon dioxide. We are making a lot more of that carbonic acid. So what's going to correlate is we're going to have be acidotic, and our pH is actually going to be less than 7.35. And we'll go over this in another slide as well. Then we can look at our bicarbonate. And if our bicarbonate is normal, which is going to be 22 to 26, then we don't have to worry about anything. We've already established it was a respiratory issue. But if our bicarbonate has changed, we need to understand what that means. So if our bicarbonate is less than 22, then that means that the bicarbonate levels are going to be lower than normal, which it would also be acidic because we don't have as much base present. If our bicarbonate is above 26, then that means that our base is higher than normal. So we have a higher base, which would make our patient alkalotic. And this is kind of where Rome comes in. So Rome stands for our respiratory is opposite and our metabolic is equal. And what this means is that in relation to the pH, if the pH is not normal and it's a respiratory problem, if the pH is low, then our PCO2 is going to be opposite of that and it's going to be high. If our pH is high, then our respiratory, our PCO2 is going to be opposite and it's going to be low. If it is a metabolic problem, then we know that the opposite is going to be true. For a metabolic problem, if our pH is low, we can look at our bicarb, and it will also be low because metabolic is equal. They both go in the same direction. If our metabolic pH is high, then our bicarb is also going to be high. So, I know it's a little bit confusing. We're going to look at all these levels, and I will go over them in more slides in more detail as well. So just kind of hang in there with me. So remember, when the pH is less than 7.35, that's going to represent acidosis. Whether it is going to be metabolic or respiratory is going to be determined by your PCO2, which is your respiratory. If it is opposite of what the pH is, as in it's going in the opposite direction, then that will mean that it's a respiratory issue. If your pH is high or low and your bicarb is going in the same direction, as in the number is high or low, and it's the same, pH is high, bicarb is high, pH is low, bicarb is low, then you know that it is a metabolic problem. You also need to know that this is also going to be how we determine if the patient is compensating, and we will go into that here in just a little bit. So like we discussed, all of these systems are trying to regulate the pH. So when we talk about compensation, basically we're saying that one system is not working correctly. So if our respiratory system is not working correctly, our renal, our metabolic system is going to try to kick in, and it's going to try to compensate for the imbalance to get that pH back into balance between that 7.35 and 7.45. And so we can see how well the body is compensating when we look at our ABGs. Obviously, if it's gotten the pH back into normal range, then it has compensated well. But we can also have partial compensations where you can see that it is trying to compensate, but it is not gotten the pH back within normal range. So the other things that we can assess are our PO2 and our SaO2. And when we are assessing the PaO2, this is basically, like I've already said in another slide, that represents the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma. And that is what is readily available for our patients to use, and that's going to be in a range between 80 and 100 milligrams per hemoglobin. And then your SaO2, which it just says O2 saturation, that's just how much oxygen is being saturated onto a hemoglobin, so onto the red blood cells. And this is going to help determine the circulation of oxygen through the body. So let's take a look again at that metabolic base mnemonic Rome. So like I told you, respiratory means the pH and the PCO2 are opposite, or they're moving in opposite directions. One is up, the other is down. Metabolic means that the pH and the bicarb are equal or they're moving in the same direction. Both go up or both go down. Now, there'll be short videos that are going to cover each of the different imbalances, and I'll go into further details with all of those in helping you understand exactly what's going on. But for right now, I want you to stop and I want you to go back, re-listen to this if you have to. If it doesn't make sense, try to re-listen to it and maybe put it into your own words how you understand what is going on.